Today I will be teaching you the basics, how to transform any lightweight shawl or blanket pattern into a very stunning accent piece for winter. This pattern that you see here is called Lost in Time. It's by Joanna Lindahl. I will leave her Ravelry link in the description box below. Make sure that you go check that out. I will not be doing a tutorial for this pattern today. I just wanted to show it to you guys because it is a great example of how to use velvet and cotton together. In order to create this look, you will need a 1 or 2 weight cotton yarn, a 4 or 5 weight velvet yarn, a 3.75 millimeter or 4 millimeter crochet hook, some scissors, and a small yarn needle. I recommend using 2 different types of yarn. I recommend using Yarn Art Flowers or Yarn Art Flowers Moonlight for your cotton blend yarn. This is a super fine 1 weight yarn. And this colorway that you see here, if you're curious, is 3269. The next yarn I recommend is Bernat Baby Velvet or Bernat Velvet. This Baby Velvet is a 4 weight yarn and the Bernat Velvet is a 5 weight yarn. You can choose what is best for your pattern. I want to start by explaining the differences between foreground and background stitches. This is important because when you first get your pattern, you want to study it and decide where velvet will look best in your background stitches only. We're only putting velvet in our background stitches, not the foreground stitches. So foreground stitches would be like your starring or decorative stitches, and then your background stitches would be like your supporting or non-decorative stitches. If you have a pattern that has uniform stitches in it, for example, like a granny shawl or something that has a 1-row repeat, where you're just repeating the same row over and over again, if you wanted to add velvet to a pattern like this, you could work in ratios. For example, you could do a 3-row ratio. You would do 3 rows of cotton, and then you would work 1 row of velvet. And then you would work 3 rows of cotton and 1 row of velvet, and 3 rows of cotton and 1 row of velvet until your project was completed. Or if you had a slightly larger project, you could do a 5-row repeat, so you would work 5 rows of cotton and 1 row of velvet instead. Or if you had a large project, you could do a 9-row repeat where you would work 9 rows of cotton and 1 row of velvet. And those are just examples of what you could do with uniform stitches. You can decide whatever looks best in your pattern, but uniform stitches are the easiest way to learn how to add velvet to your pattern. That way you don't get into these complicated stitches where you have to figure out what's background and what's foreground. You can kind of just get underway and get things going. But if you're up for the challenge, I will tell you how to do a more complicated pattern. So to begin, if your pattern, like this shawl, starts at the center of the project, you want to start by crocheting your foundational stitches, which are the first few rows of your project, in cotton yarn. You want to do this in cotton yarn because you don't want the center of your project to get distorted or too bulky using the velvet yarn. Now, however, if your pattern begins at the outer edge of your project, like it would in a blanket or a scarf, if you have like a more rectangle project, start by crocheting the foundational stitches, which is usually your first chain, in velvet. You can even do your first couple rows in velvet if you want to, if you think that that will look nice. There are a few rules to crocheting with velvet and cotton together. So the first rule is that you want to crochet your first rows in cotton or velvet, depending on whether your pattern begins at the center or whether your pattern begins at the outer edge. Number 2, you want to add your velvet in single rows at a time only. You want to alternate between cotton and velvet to maintain the drape of your project. If you have too much velvet in one place with such a small hook, you're going to end up with a stiff project. So like I did here in all of these background, this is a cluster of background stitches. I alternated velvet, cotton, velvet, cotton, velvet, cotton, back and forth, so that I didn't have too much velvet blocking up one area, and it also acts as a decorative stitch when you do that. You want to use cotton only for your foreground stitches, like these beautiful flowers or these beautiful shells here. You don't want to do those in velvet because they'll get distorted and lost in the pattern. It's okay, however, to use cotton or velvet for connecting stitches, usually a V-stitch. So like a V-stitch is something you would put a decorative stitch into. So anytime you're going to put a decorative stitch into something, you can use cotton or velvet for that stitch. It just depends on your judgment and what you think would look best. Number 5, you really want to, for a project like this, because you're working with 2 different types of yarn, you want to fasten your yarn and weave your ends as you go so that you don't get overwhelmed in the end of your project trying to figure out where to hide all of this velvet that you're gonna have, because velvet is a bulkier yarn than the cotton, and it's hard to hide the velvet in the cotton stitches if they get in the way. So it's best that you weave your ends as you go into the previous row that you worked. And finally, if you've never worked with velvet before and you're having a hard time seeing your stitches, you can squeeze them to see where they begin and where they end. You can usually feel your post for sure, and then you can feel the connecting joins at the ends of your stitches if you get lost. And that's just one final tip I had for you guys. If you have any questions about this lesson, if you wanted to add anything or feel like I forgot something, feel free to let me know in the comments. I usually respond in a timely manner. And if you liked this tutorial, please give me a thumbs up, please subscribe, and I will see you next time, guys. I hope you enjoyed.